you all again this morning. So it's my pleasure to introduce our morning keynote, Michealene Cristini Risley. And in preparing for the introduction, I realized I could be talking during her entire time that she has to talk and trying to figure out what to say and how to introduce her, because she does so many things. So she is an award-winning writer, director, entrepreneur, and human rights activist. She founded, I'm going to say a couple of things I've pulled out of her bio rather than all of them, just some amazing things. She founded and ran the nonprofit Freshwater Haven from 2002 to 2014 to address the drastic social change required to stop physical, sexual, and emotional abuse of women and children. She's a documentary filmmaker. Her film Tapestries of Hope was shown on campus a few days ago, the story of a human rights activist in Zimbabwe working to expose the myth behind the belief that raping a virgin cures a man of HIV/AIDS. She has worked with Fortune 500 companies such as Walt Disney and Nike. At Adidas, she launched The Power of Two, the first ever maternity shoe line. Last night, I downloaded and started to read her first co-authored book, This Is Not the Life I Ordered, 50 Ways to read your handwriting. 50 ways to keep your head above water when life keeps dragging you down. As VP for Identity and Character Development for Sega of America, she championed the Sega Girls Task Force and produced more than 100 animations, along with many, many other things there. So, along with all of it, she also ran for President of the United States in 2014.
Can you run again?
Yeah. Yes, and I'm here to start a platform.
You made how many people
next time. One of her goals in doing that was to try to encourage the candidates to tell the truth, and we need this more than ever, right? Honored as one of Silicon Valley's most influential women, it's my pleasure to introduce you and let you hear what she has to say. Thank you so much for coming to our conference.
Thanks. Good morning. It's funny, when anyone describes my career, I always keep looking behind me like, who are they talking about? I went to school here. It's quite interesting to be back. And I, like Carrie and Brian, are pretty amazed that so many people got out so early. I'm sure some of you are gamers and programmers, and you had to not hit the bed before 3 a.m., so thank you. I thought I'd start off by sharing a bit of my background in the video game sector. It's a sector that I fell in love with as a kid and started out with pinball. And like one of my nephews, I could put a quarter in and play for 2 hours. So I loved it. And at first I went to Hollywood and worked a lot in production. When Sega first approached me, I was running Marvel's animation unit right in the middle of a series called Biker Months from Mars. And at that time, Sega's market share was probably less than 5%. And I didn't even know, was it Sega, Zynga, who were these guys? And that was, of course, way before the Sega screen. This was back in 1991. At this time, the industry was on the 3rd generation of 8-bit systems and the 4th generation of 16-bit systems. So it was a really, really interesting time. We had already experienced Space Wars, Pong, Frogger, Pac-Man, and of course, Donkey Kong. So I happened to jump into the business when SOA, Sega of America, was beginning a horse race with Nintendo for domination of the 16-bit market. It was really an amazing time to be there. So I want to show you, if I can move this forward. Oh, I knew I'd get tech issues. Here we go. So basically, Sega hired me to build a team. There was just myself that came up from Southern Cal, and they said, we need you, we've got 2 animated series we just signed deals on, and we need you to run it. So the Japanese parent company had just bought an animation facility, so I integrated the team. We did both network and syndication, and did roughly about 180 episodes of Sonic. So it was really an incredible time. you know, at that same time, we turned Sonic into a billion-dollar business. When I first arrived there, we had, you know, a lot of merchandising and product categories, but especially with the launch of the TV shows, it was really a time when a great number of companies came to us and said, oh my God, we want to do Sonic. So we turned Sonic into a billion-dollar business. And at that same time, I began to voice my concern about the lack of women in games. So we had no women playing games at that time. And we actually formed a little task force. I'm going to show you this only because it shows you how old I am now. But what we did is, when we began to develop games for girls, what was so important about it is we thought, or I thought, that if we didn't develop the skill set in half our population, they would not be able to succeed in life. So I pitched the executive team. Now I was, you know, I pitched it from a different perspective because we were very focused on making money. And it was really important to pitch it in a way that the executives would say, oh, this makes sense. So I said, basically, if I was going to level the playing field, it was not going to sit well until I said, okay, here's how we make money. So the three critical factors I presented with this: there was a huge market for Sega that we had ignored. The market was $1 billion opportunity. And if we didn't aggressively go after it, somebody else would. And Nintendo was already doing a number of things in games that were much more gender diverse. So this is how you can see how old I am now. We started the first girls' task force, and what was so important about it is we took sectors of the whole company. So myself, we had licensing, marketing, and product development. The third woman to the left, Cindy Clavern, was the first product development person we had at Sega. And she became she was the only one we had. So it was really important to talk about how to include girls and how to incorporate gaming for them. So at this point, and I say this because I know there's faculty and gamers and also students, and one of the things I like to talk about is the challenge it was for working for a Japanese company. So at that point, I was the highest ranking woman in the Japanese company, and the Japanese executives would never look at me. So I would, with a sense of humor, say, okay, how am I going to deal with this? And I hired a male assistant, which made it even more confusing. And so I used to put a picture of myself on my shoes with an arrow up so that they would look at my face. It was never very effective. But most of the time I didn't take it personally because it was cultural. And I think that's one of the things that I'd like to talk about today, because we really need to look at our culture and what we're doing in games. So one of the things that I also want to talk about is, because there's so few female leaders, I should have mic'd myself, right? So I can walk around.
Yeah.
It's okay. I don't hear
You can still do it.
Can you hear me back there? Okay.
Not that great.
Not that great. Yeah, sorry, I'm too busy walking. Thank you. Appreciate it. Because I was one of the few female leaders at Sega, when we do product development review, and as we looked at the number of products coming through, I would be the token woman that would sort of be the moral compass. Okay, what's this game? So, for example, one time we had Sega Japan bring over a game that they developed, and it was a group of men. It was a drinking game with a group of men, and every time a man drank a beer or took a sip of beer, there would be this young schoolgirl in a schoolgirl uniform who would take off a piece of clothing. So that game did not see distribution in America. So really, at that time, we didn't even have the ratings board yet. So it was a very early time in games, and I was sort of the Sega's code of conduct. So let's talk about the current video game business. 1.2 billion people play games worldwide. 1.2 billion people, think about that. Never in the history of our country have we, or in the history of the world, have we had so many people who are connected at the same time. So you can look at that as, current games like Pokemon. I mean, how many times in downtown East Lansing, or downtown Lansing, you're seeing people walking around playing Pokemon, right? Pokemon became a huge phenomenon because it illustrates this influence and power of the medium, right? In fact, Pokemon surpassed other social media, huge partners like Twitter and Facebook, and became the #1 mobile app in the world. This blend of real and digital worlds through AR, technologies like VR and AR, is the future of the sector. So when you think about it, the power and influence that can bring us together and divide us is something that we've never seen before. And because of the radical change in the technology and widespread use, I think part of why I wanted to speak here today is I think it's a really critical time to relook at what we're doing and how we can incorporate both males and females, all races and ethnic origins in a way that helps us build a better society. Video games have played a critical influence on our culture, on our behavior, and how gender, religion, and race are viewed. Yet as a society, unless you're working daily in the sector, things pivot and shift so quickly, it's often hard to figure out what's in a game. As a parent, it's very hard to stay on top of things. So it's, even when, I think it's very hard because what's happened is our kids have become so much more technically savvy than we have. And so when a new app comes out or a new technology, they master it far before we do. So one of the things we want to look at as parents and as adults and as developers is how people are represented. And I think it's a specific, I'd hope that you can remain open today as we talk about this, because I know it's a tough subject, but it's a fundamental problem for us in specific apps and console and AR and VR. All these technologies have a direct influence on our kids. They have a direct influence on our society and our social contract. So let me talk a little bit about our social contract. How many with the show of hands have a clear idea of what a social contract is? Okay. So a social contract is the agreement each person in a society agrees to abide by. Civil society is what we enter into when we agree to live in a community. Without that, I think we have a lot of chaos. By agreeing to live within a civil society, we look out for each other, we learn to be rational and moral, and the whole idea behind it is that this civil society exists for mutual preservation. Now that may sound very obvious, right? The common good is what is in the best interest of society. This is what the social contract is meant to achieve, and it's what the general aims for. I'd like to say that I believe the social contract we have here in America is broken. And I think it's broken through many sectors of business and government. Video games is just one sector, but it's a sector that has a high degree of influence on our culture. What breaks up the social contract? I think money is a key factor. When money comes in the mix, we lose or ignore our social contract to the detriment of society. And I think that we're not asking ourselves the right questions. So I think the question we need to ask ourselves is not whether the product will make money, but how will it affect our society? Or even further, how can we create a product that will have a positive effect on our children and our culture and make money? And I think you can do both. Think about it this way. Some of the most violent video games that desensitize and normalize violence make a great deal of money. And then ask yourself the question, and how do they impact our world? It's my hope that you leave here today with a deeper understanding of the mechanisms in play and how much the world you live in affects our culture. And as professors and facilitators and developers, that you can become part of the change. So indoctrination happens very young, and I remember the social contract is about looking out for the community, for each other, and being moral, and it exists for mutual preservation. So again, when that money comes in, we introduce we lose our social contract. Grand Theft Auto is a great example, right? So the indoctrination of video games, and I really want to talk more about, is sexism. And when you think about it, it doesn't start with video games. Sexism starts in the womb. It continues when we're wearing pink and blue hats in the maternity ward. And it continues when toy companies decide whether a product should be played for a boy or a girl. And they categorize it in a way. I used to work at Mattel, and we go, okay, so we'll choose boys for this game because we'll give them the directions, but they don't have as much imagination as girls. And a lot of that was not based in science. It was based in an inherent bias. So remember, these are people who are deciding what toys we play, what shelves they go on, and what consumer they're targeting. So for myself, nowhere was this more illustrated than after having worked at Mattel and Sega, that I took my boys to it was sort of like a video game play center. And they were very excited because they saw the Sega arcade motorcycle racing. There were two big arcade games. And they were 4 and 5. And jumping up and down, and in fact, they used to call it a motorcycle. They didn't even know, they couldn't even call it a motorcycle. And they said, please, Mom, can we play? So I said, sure. I put them side by side in the arcade machines. And I popped the token in, and the first thing that came up was this. And then a little bit of this, right? And of course, you can't forget the flaggers, right? And so here I was as a mom of a 4 and 5-year-old, and I could not protect them from their indoctrination into the world of sexism. I could not protect them from the beginning objectification of women. And we can all sit here and say, it doesn't matter, and yet it really does. So, the sexualization of women in games and mass culture. So this sexualization is a significant part of our culture. And it has become increasingly part of the world culture because we export our media so much to the rest of the world. And unfortunately, as you see by my sons, and it's actually worse now, is that objectification happens earlier and earlier. YouTube, Twitch, social media, Snapchat, Instagram, and oftentimes, again, it's the children who master the technology. Like if I put a block on a technology for my son, trust me, he knows how to unblock it, right? So, and I'm in the sector. So imagine parents and adults who are not in the sector. Like if you don't know video games, you don't know that in Grand Theft Auto, as a reward, you can jump in the backseat of a car with a prostitute. So I think it's really difficult for adults to screen what their children are seeing. And because of the flood of new technology to younger and younger kids, that increased sexual imaging, think about it, TV, cable, the access to porn, these sexism and violence have become normalized in our society. And you see it in what people are talking about with the rape culture. You see it in our current presidential race. The good news is sexism is a learned and conditioned behavior for both males and females. It happens in subtle ways or not so subtle ways when the most popular games still display intense gender antagonism. Remember Carmen Sandiego and the sexy Latin woman were the half-naked heroines in the Marvel Universe? Newer entries are focusing on stronger female characters, but there's still not a lot of diversity, a lot of variety. And these heroines that go out and battle the world are wearing bikinis or leotards. And I don't know about you, but when you go to work, usually you want at least some armor and some body protection. So these characters not only represent a male fantasy, and I know the room is actually predominantly male, but I think that it shows that we have to begin to widen our perspective, because these characters also represent images that are impossible to sustain for women. So not only are we sexualized and objectifying, but we feel bad about ourselves because we can't do it. I mean, we can't live up to that. So this helps cultivate an expectation and feed the inherent bias. You know, so the idea is women go out and save the world from a chemical attack in a day. They go home and cook a 5-star meal, and then change into their French maid's outfit to have sex with their husband. So all this done without breaking a nail. It's come up in the presidential debates, and it's very true. We are all inherently biased. I know myself when I go into a room full of, you know, let's say I go in a conference room with a company, that if I don't know who the team is, if I hear a male voice, I inherently go, oh, he must be in charge. And so I constantly have to look at my own inherent bias and what I'm doing and how to change it. I think that's part of the solution. We have to challenge ourselves. And when you look at the presidential debates, you can see this inherent bias. And again, it happens in every sector, which is again why we need to understand how critical it is to bring parity into the sectors of the business and government. It's hard to talk about this because I realize how much anger there is, and this is a subject a lot of people do not want to talk about. I think if we don't talk about it, and it's not talking about with things like Gamergate and naming and shaming, it's really about what inherent biases we have and how do we begin to talk in that discomfort to a better place. Just to demonstrate how much bias in our bones, and I'm going to take a sector that we've all watched recently. I want to show you. This is from the Rio Olympics. Can you hear it back there? No.
Microphone next to it. There it is.
Got it? Like this.
We're still on the ads.
Oh, got it. Now think about this. These are the top female athletes in the world.
Sexism, where we judge Olympic sexist coverage as a sport. The field is really looking strong this year. Let's take a look at some of our best competitors. Up first, here's Adam Freed from the CBC, talking about Canadian tennis player Eugenie Bouchard, and he describes her as not being a competitor because she posts selfies with toothpaste.
She's posting pictures of herself, she's holding up the toothpaste, and she's trying out different hairstyles, and maybe she wants something different than to be a competitor.
It's definitely impressive to claim that a female athlete who's dedicated her entire life to her sport may not be interested in competing. But he could have made his sexism more explicit by, I don't know, asking her to twirl after she achieved a huge feat, like winning a match at the Australian Open or something.
Can you give us a twirl and tell us about your outfit?
Next, watch this unnamed NBC commentator talking about the U.S. female gymnastics team.
They might as well be standing in the middle of a mall.
A classic sexist ageist combo there. He's suggesting that these teenage girls belong in malls, not destroying the competition on an international stage. While we wait for the next competitor, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the new emerging discipline, Olympic bra appropriating, a discipline where a female athlete's success is repackaged and presented as a male one. Like Dan Hicks representing NBC after Humphreys Katinka Hozu shattered the world record and won the 400-meter individual medley.
And there's the guy responsible for turning Katinka Hozu, his wife, into a whole different swimmer.
Coming up next is the Chicago Tribune, who entered a tweet war. Impressive. This comment makes no mention of this female athlete's name or the sport that she plays. That is ace dehumanization. And here comes John Imperdale, representing the BBC. He's somewhat of a veteran of the sport, attempted a backhanded body-shaming comment in 2013, but let's see if he can take sexist commentary to the next level this time.
You're the first person ever to win 2 Olympic tennis gold medals. That's an extraordinary feat, isn't it?
No hesitation.
Well, to defend the singles title, I think Venus and Serena won about 4 each.
Ouch. Venus, Grand, Salami, sexism time. I mean, that play deserves a standing ovation. Asking a man to take credit for a record that 2 women have already broken. I mean, male privilege of stale. Infidel was inches away from being correct. I mean, qualified with singles. But I also think the erasure of women's accomplishments should have come in a little sooner before the ignorance settled in. The next contestant looks like a headline describing Katie Ledecky setting a new world record in the women's 800-meter freestyle, becoming the first woman to win gold in the 200, 400, and 800-meter freestyle races since 1968. But this article put that second to a silver by Michael Phelps. Even when women come in first, the media puts them second. And here's Mercury News. They're really the Cinderella story of Olympic sexism. This week refers to gold medal champion Simone Manuel, like Donald Trump refers to his black supporters.
But look at my African American over here. Look at him.
He just wanted one. But the last contestant is really a collaboration between many, many news organizations having just some flawlessly demeaning debates, like whether an Olympic athlete got breast implants, or racially charged debates about an athlete's hair. And energetic yet slightly Islamophobic segments exoticizing hijabs. But structural sexism takes collaboration. I mean, it really takes a village. A recent study that looked at over 160 million words within the domain of sport demonstrated higher levels of infantilizing or traditionalist language for women in sport.
But then again, what do we expect? When
This is
90%
important.
of sports editors are white and the same proportion are male.
But things are changing, and newsrooms are becoming more and more diverse, which would hopefully mean that shows like The Wide World of Sexism would become completely obsolete. Until then, join us tomorrow night for our special edition of Is It a Burqa or a Bikini? Let's just definitely not call it what it is, which is a hijab. Also, who the cares?
So as you can see, why I wanted to point out 90% of sports writers are men. And so much of this is not done consciously, it's unconscious, it's not many times on purpose, it's just how we are culturally ingrained. So again, the sector's not alone, and it's really critical for women
For a
to be
long
represented.
time, running was for weirdos.
For women to be represented in the sector. All right, There are many games that sexualize women to varying degrees. For example, one that I mentioned earlier, one of the most popular money-making games is Grand Theft Auto. In that game, players are rewarded with a romp with a prostitute in the backseat of a car. This is a reward. If that's not exciting, you can beat her, kill her, or just throw her out the car. So I actually know the guys who did Grand Theft Auto, and one of the things they say is, this is never intended for a 10 or 12-year-old. Well, the thing is, whether it is or not, kids aspire upwards, and particularly if something's they're not supposed to touch or play with, the first thing they're going to do is play Grand Theft Auto, and they have access. In God of War, Kratos, the male protagonist, would have sex with 2 topless prostitutes. You know, I could go on for a half hour about some of the games, and you know, as a woman, how difficult it is to watch. But one of the key reasons that women are sexualized in games is the perception and the belief that putting sex in games makes money. Okay, it sells games. But is that true? And it depends on who you ask. If you look at study after study, it's not so clear. From the beginning of advertising, sex was used to sell things as simple as soap, right? The use of sexual imagery in advertising has been criticized on various grounds. Religious conservatives often consider it obscene and immodest. Conservatives, others claim using sex reinforces sexism by objectifying the individual, who has oftentimes very little to do with what is being sold. Advertisers try to reach low-income and less educated men, and they depict 2 different types of male phenotypes: physically violent or sexually aggressive. So even for men, that portrayal is very narrow. So if you look at different studies, so on Media Viral's Video Tracker, of the top 20 most viewed commercials, only 1 uses sex. If you look at Ad Age Magazine's list of top 100 Over the top 100 most effective advertising of the century, only 8 use sex. You know, we can review various data to figure out if sex sells. But again, I think we should be asking a different question. And that question is, should we be using sex to sell product, and at what cost to our social contract? I think that's worth repeating. You know, at what cost to our social contract? And then the larger question is, why on earth would we allow the advertising community to dictate our culture, how we live, who we are, and what we teach our children? So this also brings us right back to money and that social contract. I think when you put our social contract against money, the social contract dissolves. So a bigger question for us is, what kind of role models are we creating for both sexes? This is not good for boys either. So I've created a chart here for you. Hopefully you can see this in a way. So if you look at the messages we're taught from when we were little, boys compete, girls get along and be nice. Boys are very hierarchical, and girls are taught to be collaborative. Boys like to dominate, but who do they dominate? They dominate girls, and when they dominate girls, a number of things happen. Girls are taught to problem solve. Boys winning at all costs. Girls are taught community. So violence is part of the male culture. But when we teach boys violence, we teach girls fear. The boys' narrow definition of women, so mother, caretaker, girlfriend, wife, and sex object. It's pretty narrow. The sad thing about this, if you look, women are defined by our body and looks, and we're defined by that by men. So men can obtain power and privilege, but women can only obtain that through a man. Men's sexual activity is encouraged. Women's sexual activity is vilified. Now here's the thing, even as a little girl, you know, Jamie pulled my hair. Well, the message was, he likes you. And the message we give boys is, you can hurt girls, you can call them names, and geez, we are aware that you're not able to control your aggression. That's what we tell them. When they are aggressive, we say, oh, boys will be boys. And we teach girls to be wary. So think about it. The messages we give boys create fear in our girls. They rate and evaluate, you know, basically boys are taught to rate and evaluate women's bodies, and women are taught that our worth is defined by men. And this is partly when women begin to compete with each other. We could spend an hour on the Greek culture and structure and how that affects not only males and females, but how it affects the rape culture. So boys, you can't cry, you can't act like a pussy, you know, only girls cry. And then the question is, you know, what's wrong with girls? So I think we need to begin to look at the messaging we give. And I certainly think we need to really start talking about who's creating our culture. So both boys and girls need role models that include their parents and brothers and sisters and extended family. But video games, media, books, all play a huge part. In fact, in some parts of our families, they play the larger part than family influence. So as faculty and industry, how can we be more acutely aware of what's happening? And how can we create a range of behaviors, a range of phenotypes that increase the narrow definition, not only for girls, but for boys? Part of the problem is, and I mentioned earlier, is the world is so busy. And now most families, both parents are working. It's a full-time job to screen what your kids are watching and censor what your children are consuming. So you have an opportunity to discuss these issues, challenge the standard thinking, and make sure both sides, male and female, are exposed to and understand the implications from what you develop. Here's why you should care. Playing video games can lead to lack of empathy, can lead to violence and abuse. You've probably heard all these statistics. When a young man rapes an unconscious woman, like the Brock Turner case at Stanford, It caused an outcry for a number of reasons. It continues to set the stage for men and boys with a message that they can do horrible deeds and get away with it. But so here's the other side of that. Jane Doe's letter to Brock Turner has over 25 million views. It's been translated in 14 different languages because there are so many victims. Obviously, something's not working. The use of violent and sexual images of women in games, many studies have shown the following. The desensitization that we talked about. Using women as rewards show men and women that women are supposed to be used as gratification. It is partly why sexual assault is out of control, and I'm happy to talk to anyone offline about how that's so. We have normalized violence. Now, another element of this, who I don't have time to talk about, but violent video games actually are a gateway to pornography. And why we should care about that, I'll talk about. Both video games and pornography allow an addiction that not only allows the user to get hooked on arousal, but it actually rewires the brain. Just Google online how many porn users are in rehab of some type, because it not only does the brain chemistry affect them, but they're having a difficult time living in the real world. The Center for Disease Control has talked about violent games being the gateway for regular porn use. And we're just at the beginning of seeing the effects of porn use on a generation. And it's not pretty. And that's why I'm so passionate about the fact that I think we need to begin to shift. Video games and porn can start a cycle of isolation. Players begin to feel more comfortable isolated rather than a social situation. So it becomes a place where they actually get depressed and less physical than non-users. So think about it, they become more comfortable in settings in a fantasy world rather than healthy face-to-face interactions, social and sexual. So think about this next generation that would rather play games than interact. And think about that, how that affects our society, how that affects their work and their lives. So if we're ignoring real life situations in favor of games, if we are desensitized, we've learned that it can actually create a way in which users act out in violent ways. Again, games like Grand Theft Auto reward players for that, and it just reinforces that thinking. We all know this study too. There's a link between violent games and aggression. In study after study, both adults and children were more aggressive after playing video games. Players who identified with violent perpetrators reinforce that aggressive behavior. And is it any wonder that we have created a culture of sexism and violence where 1 out of every 4 girls is sexually assaulted on campus? Where sorority women, so think about this, sorority women are 3 times as likely to be raped on campus. So we're already at 25% of college graduates will be assaulted. So in a recent interview, Melinda Gates spoke about gender parity, and it's really important. And I'd love for you to hear what she has said, and Ryan, you might need to come back and switch again. Can't skip through the commercial, sorry.
You think of the United States as so advanced, and we are in so many ways, but a tiny fraction of women are Fortune 500 CEOs. We're yet to have a female president, right? South Korea, Germany, UK have all let us on female leaders. Women still make less for equal work, for the exact same job as men do. And more women and girls live in poverty in this country. Is that something we're actually not talking about enough in this country? When you put it all together?
I think you have to talk about it. We have to show what's actually going on in our country. And part of the reason I've even started to speak on these issues is because I would be in low-income countries and thinking, women aren't this far, they aren't that far, if they had this. But then I would have to fly back home and I'd be asking myself, but how far have we really come? I mean, we've made huge strides, but we've kind of hit a stopping point in some ways. And we need to have more women role models. I mean, until young girls can look up and see, 36 different phenotypes of CEOs in Fortune 500 companies, 36 phenotypes of women in government and women in philanthropy and women as scientists and women as technologists, until they can look up and see all that role modeling, we're not going to get parity for men and women in all of these industries. And we need to. I mean, there's just no reason not to. We know that more diverse teams put out a better product.
You say basically that we were making all of this progress and in this country, it sounds like sort of plateaued. Is there a point, Melinda, when you think that happened and why?
I don't think there's one point where it happened on any one of those things. I think we just got to a certain point and then it kind of stopped. So you get to almost 20% of women in Congress, and some years it falls back and it kind of goes back up. CEOs, we kind of got up to a certain point and then it falls back. So, you can go industry by industry and say, why did it happen? But I just know we're not far enough. One of the industries that I'm passionate about making sure we change is the time I'm a computer science major. When I got my degree, 38% of computer science degrees were given to women.
And it got a lot worse.
And now we've gone down to 17%. Why? Well, nobody exactly knows, but we think partly the games. When I was a kid, the games were more neutral games like Pong or Pac-Man, Pac-Woman, but the industry became very gamified.
You mean the video games?
The video games became very male-oriented, and women started to drop out of the industry in droves.
You graduated with a degree in computer science and economics from Duke, and you say it was the last computer science class for most of my female classmates who quickly decided they'd rather major in something else. You literally saw them falling out of the class.
Yeah, after freshman year.
You've called guys in hoodies, quote, the toxic stereotype that has become a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Well, I think I got a little misquoted on that. Look,
so set the record straight.
Okay, so look, I programmed with a lot of guys in hoodies. They were great, and I enjoyed programming with them. But I don't think that you want that being the only set that's programming, particularly when you think about where we're going with health applications, where you think about where we're going with artificial intelligence. I mean, if artificial intelligence, which I think is where we're going, if that's going to be taking care of our older generation, do you want just 25-year-old somethings, doing that program? I think you want some generative thinking in there. And so I think you want to have a diverse set of talent. I think you want to have more women. I think you want to have more Latinos in there, more African Americans in there. We all should be contributing to that and where the future is going. And if fixing it now is going to be far easier than trying to fix it later.
Girls' education in STEM. The numbers are sort of appalling when you look at it, even in middle school, in high school, for these girls, and then it translates higher and higher up to many fewer women get patents, for example. What needs to change?
In terms of the STEM fields, one of the things we know that good teaching looks like for girls and for boys is really for girls keeping their self-esteem up. So girls go through a time in middle school where they think differently about themselves. And so in science and math, they often lose their self-esteem. They kind of lean back. We have to keep their self-esteem up and make them know that even when the boys are shouting out the answer and the girls are raising their hand, the teacher calls on everybody equally.
It seems like it might make a whole lot of sense to mandate that children in public schools learn how to code. Will we get there?
I don't know whether it's mandate or whether it's just fun.
Or even encourage or even habit.
Absolutely. In New York City schools is doing that. Kids learning to code these days, if they learn to do it early, I think you'll get far more of them hooked on it. And I think the other thing is, I have a young daughter who's coding. She's 14. She just sees it as fun, right? I mean, she started coding when she was 12. I don't know what she'll do with it, whether she'll go on in that field or whether she'll use it in some other field. The girls are starting to learn that this is fun. And also when they see role models, they say, okay, it's not just that woman who looks a little geeky to me, but wow, there's a woman who I respect and who looks fantastic and like somebody I'd like to be.
So, you get the idea. She talks about, how we will all fare better if we begin to develop parity. And I think, again, it's the idea of any single age group or any single gender programming, large sex. It's really critical to look at and start talking about these issues. So what can you do as leaders? I want you to think about a couple things. How can you incorporate gender, race, and generative thinking in your gaming? Like in Silicon Valley right now, we have a huge ageism issue. And people like Tom Kalinske, who ran Mattel, Sega, Leapfrog, people like that have a great deal of knowledge. And they're being put on the side in a way where I believe that we're losing knowledge. And so I think we need to challenge ourselves to not have people around us that look exactly like us. So Reed Hastings said recently at Stanford, someone asked him about why there were not more women on boards, and he said, 15 years ago when this came up, I said, oh, come on, just let it happen organically. And he said, I was wrong. He said, I want to bring in my buddies so we can go hang out. He goes, I want people around me that I know and I feel comfortable with. We've got to start shifting how we think about it. So, a couple things. We know about the research, but I think one of the things we need to do is we need to educate the gaming community. Include the gaming community in the conversations. How do we eliminate the negative portrayals of women? You may not be concerned about it now. Maybe you are concerned about it now, but I think someday you will be concerned. And I can't stress enough that it's not just about the girls, it's about the boys. I think we can also put more women on teams and give them a voice, and a real voice, not the token voice that I was, and listen. Consider leadership training. I don't think anyone needs more sensitivity training. I don't think we need blaming and shaming. I think we need to figure out and teach men and women to stand up and say, hey, you know what? That's not appropriate. Or if a woman says something in a meeting and then it's negated and then 3 people down, a male says it, and it says it's the exact same idea, then someone pipe up and say, oh yeah, that was the idea that Lydia just said. So that we begin to hear differently. I'd love to think about providing a moral code to the culture of video games. I bring up Gamergate again because there were so many parts of Gamergate that were horrible. Stalking and death threats and rape. It's just all directed at women that make them very uncomfortable in the space. They don't feel safe, and that's not okay. And as teachers and facilitators, take that conversation. Don't avoid it. Just say, okay, where the heat is, where the discomfort is, go in and say, okay, let's have a conversation about it. It's not easy, but it will get easier. I'm close to running out of time, so I'm just going to recap the rest of this and what we think we can do. Again, if you're in a chat room, if you're live, what can you do if you see someone acting out? When you have an incubation or immersion program, take on these issues. Michigan State has a great program that I saw yesterday at the Hatch. This should be part of the program to talk about these issues. And point it out in class and active discussions. The internet allows for something called the online disinnovation effect, which essentially means that you can hide behind your computer. But what we all know is anything you write online, anything you say is public. And this can affect many things, including your job prospects. I think the last couple of things I'd like to say is the gaming community should become a safe space for women and men, for races and religions. And we've got to figure out a way to do that. And I'm hoping with people like this and activists and more education to the public, there's a bright future with inclusive gaming. I hope you'll be a part of the solution. So I thank you. Oh, we have time for a couple questions. Any questions? Any thoughts? Yes?
Did you help make Sonic?
Did I help make Sonic? Well, Sonic was actually created by a group of Japanese developers in Japan. So your answer is no, though I know you're disappointed in me now. No, it was created out of Japan and a great group of men. Is that your favorite game? No? What's your favorite game? You don't know? All right. Any other questions? How many people, honestly, are angry at me right now? Seriously? Yes. Go ahead.
Maybe a comment as much as a question. So I'm wondering, I agree with 90% of your content. And
Yeah.
one of the things that I do think I would raise issues, I'm a psychologist and a professor and deal with mentoring women all the time.
Yeah.
About the conflicts around that or the challenges around that. And I think one of the problems is that when we think about, for example, when we talk about video games, we really talk sometimes about them as this whole thing. And so I really appreciated you pulling out the exact names that you thought had, some issues with sexism and how they could socialize something hurtful and harmful behaviors. But on the other hand, there's been a couple of meta-analyses that have shown that violent video games and real-world aggression, rather than just ketchup, giving somebody hot sauce or something like that, there isn't a straightforward connection. And there's lots of research suggesting that it's really about the home environment and all sorts of other really important societal issues that are going to contribute to that real-world aggression. And I think we might be doing a disservice when we make those kind of simple connections, because what I think we can say is that video games can teach behaviors and attitudes. And as much as they might teach these stereotypes and prejudice and horrible kinds of attitudes and behaviors, they can also teach really good ones as well. So harnessing that, and thinking about what designers can do to use games to teach or facilitate thinking about these conversations, I think would be also really important to think about.
Absolutely. And actually, I think obviously we're at a video game conference, so I wanted to talk about the sector, but I think you're right in terms of if you look at all the components of where we learn this. And again, it's not just about the girls. I think we are creating a culture that 10 years from now, if we don't fix, we might really regret. So thank you for that. And thank you for your work. Any other questions? All right, I thank you very much. Oh, sorry, Jason.
So in the YouTube webcast on the prominent sexism in Olympic coverage, I wonder if you feel that the delivery of her message was productive or perhaps antagonist.
That's a great question.
I found it interesting that a few of her first examples she cited were factors of indirect product placement. Like you see, the subway. So this is advertising. Going to your point that advertising is actually, in a sense, programming the children.
Yeah.
So there's a synergy with the advertising and gaming and basic sensual programming that's coming in from every direction of the children. So that does add to that point. And the viewers are going through this for the entire life from day one.
Yeah. So
Is it clear that the profit-driven industry in part destroying our social context? And how can we disconnect ourselves from that sort of exposure without disconnecting ourselves from the technological society?
So you asked two really great questions. The first one, I actually thought about whether I wanted to play that or not in terms of the Rio Olympics, because I think the content is great and the delivery is antagonistic. And so even when I watch it, I cringe a little bit. So I think that it's sort of that naming and shaming thing that I was talking about. If we're going to stay in that place, we're not going to get anywhere. And so I agree with you, but it was the best thing I could find, right? In terms of showing the inherent bias. But you're absolutely right, and I think that's part of the problem.
Yeah.
And the second question, yeah, absolutely. It might be her style too, I don't know. The second one is much, much harder. And I think part of the challenge is that we live in a world where that advertising culture is at the core of our society. So I don't know the answer. And in fact, one of the things I struggle with is I still think we're missing something. Like I feel like there's something missing that we haven't figured out yet. So I don't know the answer. I do think that with gender parity in these roles, if you look at the advertising world, there are very few women leaders in those roles. And the fear I have is when we get parity is that we've all learned this behavior so much that nothing will change. So, I don't know the answer. But it's certainly a great question. Yes?
Isn't the bottom line where basically we're talking about free speech and all that, that
it really starts in the home. It starts in how you're raised and what you're allowed to view and what you're allowed to do. And I think that's the ultimate question, whether it be in any type of situation, I think, would you agree that, I mean?
I think that's huge. I think it's probably the largest component, but I think that where the challenge comes in is our kids are more technically sophisticated than us. So if you put a screen or a blocker on, you know, I know Dominic's been raising hand. Like if I put a blocker on for Dominic, you know, it's over. I know. So I think we don't have the tools. Yes, Karen?
Last question.
Oh, last question, sorry.
I think it's really hard. Very important, but really hard. If you look at the Melinda Gates interview excerpt that you showed,
yeah.
At the end she said, so let's have some female examples that look really good that we want to be like. It's like, well, wait, no, we can't, you know. It's like, I think increasing consciousness and awareness is the start. And you know, even when you're trying to do it right, you do it wrong. So, but just keep trying.
Absolutely. She's just said the best.